A couple of new faces here this week. So just a brief sense of what we'll be doing this week. First, we'll just have an open discussion on some of the key concepts for this week, which are primarily React State and props, which are two very important topics. And hopefully also you can start doing more fun things now in React. And we'll spend the bulk of the time just doing some live coding together. Last couple of weeks, we've been starting to build out like a simple blog that we're just building through and leveraging the concepts that we're learning. So we're using state and props to continue working on our blog site together. And if at any point you have questions about stuff we're talking about here, other stuff that's going on that you have questions about, just put in the chat, raise your hand, just speak up, whatever. The goal here is to get all of your questions answered. So, all right. And then also you might have seen in the forum, there's a field if you have questions as well. You wanna ask. There's already someone mentioned talking about React State. We're gonna talk about React State for sure and do some examples. So you'll be able to see some of that. Cool. All right. Let's jump in. So hopefully you all have gotten a chance to maybe start reading the lessons for this week. I know it's only been a couple of days. But for those of you who haven't, there's two key concepts that we're talking about here, props and state. You can think about as ways to make components dynamic, right? So right now, for example, hopefully you all have completed week 2 by now, the assignment. You create a component, but it wasn't very fun, right? You sort of just rendered out some data and it wasn't changing at all, right? So, but now obviously, most things that you probably want to do require some sort of dynamic aspect of your application. So that's where state and prop comes in as ways to do that. And so I think this diagram actually really summarizes it pretty well conceptually. You have your component that you're working with to render out some HTML, which is kind of represented here on the right-hand side, the DOM, right? Is the rendered out HTML. And then you have these two other parts, state and props. So state is for controlling dynamic parts of your component within the component itself. And props are dynamic pieces of data that get shared with the component from the outside that the component could then use for something or the other inside of it. So that's how I would conceptually think about splitting the difference between props and state. That is sort of like, where is that dynamic data being managed, right? Is it coming from outside the component or is it within the component itself? Questions on just that high level concept before we go into each of those in more detail.
Hi.
Hey,
Hello.
Anthony. Yes.
Yeah. So do they kind of like do the same thing, but it just depends on where each of them are?
At a high level, yeah, I think that's a good way to think about it. It's both of them are ultimately about how do you make stuff dynamic in the component, right? And so it's just a question of, do you manage that within the component itself, or do you manage that by having some other parent component essentially send it down dynamically?
Okay. Okay. So sorry. So a component can get a props from the state of its parent component. All right, cool.
Yeah, exactly. And we'll see some actual examples of this, but yeah, exactly. You have a parent component, and then in that parent component, when you probably you'll like in some way say like, hey, I want this new component to be the child, and you will be able to pass those essentially in as dynamic attributes into the component.
Cool.
Any other questions before we move on, talking about each of these in more detail? All right, let's press on then. Okay, so let's start with state. So the way you can think about state, right? We talked about essentially it's used to manage any sort of dynamic content you might have within the component itself. So you can see on the right-hand side is a simple example of how you might deal with state. So state is, oh, sorry, is there a question?
No.
Okay, no worries. So state gets managed. You can think of it as variables, I guess, if you want to call it. You can think of it like variables that are kind of special in some way, right? So you can see on the right-hand side, for example, right, there's this interesting syntax that we have here, right? State, set state equals use state. So use state is something called a React hook, which I think we'll get into more exactly what that is later on in the course. But think of it as a piece of a feature of React, right? React has bundled up a bunch of interesting functionality together and sort of bundled it into this nice hook you can use, the function essentially called useState. So it's a way you can set up state in this component. And you'll notice that there's two things that return from this useState here. There's a variable called state in this case and something called set state. Obviously, these can be anything you want to call it. So state is the actual like variable that holds the values. And set state is actually how you go and update the values whenever you want to make a change. And we'll see why this is important. But the reason why this becomes relevant is you can see here kind of in the third bullet on the left is when you change the value of the state, the way that React works under the hood is it completely like redraws and re-renders out all of the JSX that you've returned from this component, right? So that's how that's why it's kind of dynamic in nature, right? Anytime any value of state changes, it will re-render out essentially HTML based on that new value of the state. And so that's really the power of why state is so cool and important. And you can see like, why is it called React? Because it's sort of reacting to these changes automatically for you and doing these re-renders as you need it. And that's why you might hear this idea of the core of React is sort of this idea of UI as a function of state, right? So as you set up the state and manage the state, as it changes, the UI sort of dynamically changes as well based on the value of state at any given point in time. And that's really the magic of React in many ways. Any questions on that? I realize this is somewhat abstract right now, and we'll see an example of this as well when we get into the coding part of the session. All right, let's press on then. Yeah, definitely like if you have questions, ask them because like state is a key part of React for sure that it's gonna come up all the time going forward. Okay, so then there's props. And props are, I think, a little bit, maybe hopefully a little bit more straightforward to understand. You can see here, again, the idea with props is this is data that's coming from outside of the component, right? So you can see a simple example here on the right, right? So you have this somewhere in your code, you'll write this, my component, and you might say, some property is equal to some value. You can name this property whatever you want. Then inside the component, you can say like, hey, this component is going to accept a prop of some kind, and I can do something with it. In this case, just render it out. And you can see then, it sort of in the final output, it will pass down this dynamic data and will render out whatever that data is that is passed in. So it's kind of similar to HTML attributes, right? More generic HTML attributes you might have seen for any of the default components or default elements in HTML. But this essentially gives you the ability to customize that to whatever you essentially want to pass through, more or less. And again, just like with state, if there's ever a change in the value of a property, it will re-render the whole component based on that new value so that it's always kind of updating the UI appropriately. Questions on this? Okay. Oh, let's see. Okay, cool. Let's keep going. Okay, so there's no questions right now. Let's just make use of this and let's do some live coding. So let me switch over to my screen. All right. Hopefully all can see my screen. So I just have our React blog project again open. Let me, just like a good developer, let's do all these changes in the new branch. So I think I have my latest main branch. We're going to check out to what is this, week 3, and I'm just going to run the application. And let's open it here in the browser. Okay, so for those of you who were here last week, you probably recognize this is where we left off. Right now, we have a list here of a bunch of articles that we have with some content, and we also have this header and this footer at the bottom. We made all these components previously. If I open up browser, you'll see all these components, article list, header, footer, etc., all being pushed into this app. Okay, so the first thing I think we should do is let's take advantage of both props and state. Let's maybe first do props. So you'll notice that there's this article list component right now. And we go into this component, you'll see it's just taking some article data that we have in this separate file, which is just an array of data that we have. And it's just going through, mapping through them, and just rendering them out in some way, the article, the author, the body, etc. Hopefully, you all feel pretty decent about this code. And it should look kind of similar to maybe some of your assignments over the last week or so. But let's say instead of hard coding essentially this article data, maybe you want to make this article more flexible and dynamic and have these articles being passed through as a prop instead. So let's switch this to use props. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, in the definition of this component, let's make sure this thing knows that it will have some props that will come through. And then we can use this. So I might go here and say, instead of articles, I'll maybe pass in props.articles. And then we can get rid of this import that we don't need. And that's cool. If I save it, actually, and try again, it turns out this doesn't work. Why? Because we're not passing these props into the article list. So let's go back into this article list, and now I need to pass in these articles. So actually, what I'm going to do is grab the import statement we had above, so we have access to that data again. And then we need to probably change this import statement to this, as we move directories. And then I need to pass these through. So here I have just props, and I notice I said props are articles. So I'm assuming that there's a property here called articles. So I need to pass that in here. So articles, I'm just going to say articles equals, and I can pass the value. In this case, I'm just going to pass these articles here. And now when I hit save, all the articles are back. So again, we've essentially moved the actual data up a level to the parent, and we are now passing the data in dynamically to this article list. And then the article list component is now assuming it is taking some props dynamically, and it's using that data then to do whatever it needs to do to render it out. Questions on any of that? Yes, okay. Let me go through that one more time. So what we have done here is we have said, first, let's start in the article list component. So previously, we had hard-coded essentially the data that this component was going to use by directly accessing this data.js files articles array. And we said just grab this data, hard-code it, and map over it to render out the list of articles that we have on the screen. So that's where we started. So then we said, well, let's not hard-code it. Let's have this component take in dynamically some array of articles, and it will render out that array that gets passed in. So the first thing we did is in the article list component, we changed now and said, instead of hard coding the articles, we're going to take some properties and we are going to get the article attribute from props, and we will use that and render it out. But now that means that this component requires some article data to pass into it. So we went into our app.jsx file where we are rendering out this article list component, and we went ahead and passed that property in called articles, and we just gave it the same articles data from this data file. To make it really clear, because we're using the same names everywhere, let's call this dummy articles instead. So this is the hard-coded array data. And now I need to change this to dummy articles and this to dummy articles. So now we're saying there's this articles prop that we are passing into articles list, and it has the value of, in this case, dummy articles. And that is being passed through now to article list, and that's what it's using now to render out this that we see the list. So functionally, it's the same as before. We can see why it might be helpful in a second, but that's now we've moved that logic up essentially to the parent. Yeah, of course. What other questions? And I will say, since I mentioned this before, this syntax should look similar to like regular HTML, right? I could be here and say like, oh, I want a p tag, paragraph, and I could pass attributes before, right? I could say like class name, and I could give it some class name, right? For example. So you can see this is also like an HTML attribute. So it's that same concept here. It's just extending that to be as flexible, and you can define any property you want. You can pass whatever data you want and pass that through. But it's kind of the same logically, kind of has the same role. Okay, so you might say like, what's the point of this? This looks exactly the same as we had before. So let me give you an example why this might be helpful. So we have dummy articles, right? And let me just change this for a second and say I want only the first element. I'm gonna, oh, this is probably a bad example, but let's just say I grab these dummy articles, and let's say I have some second set of dummy article data, dummy articles too. And here I'm just going to, let's just make some on the fly changes here. But let's see, understanding React, state, and props today, and React, state, and props are useful and cool. And sure, that's fine. So anyway, I've just essentially made some new article data, right? Separately, dummy articles too. Let's say I wanted to render this. Well, before I would need to copy and paste and, essentially rewrite all this code again, but now with the second array. But now I can just do the following. I can just say, I'm just going to reuse this component, but now instead of passing dummy articles, I'm going to pass dummy articles too, and make sure we import that as well. And now, just to see this, let me remove this first article list. Look at that. I've gotten that same logic and same UI, just with different data, just by changing a prop. And so now this is the new one we just put in. I can add these two side by side, so I can reuse this list. So I have the old data, and I still have this new one that we have below. So it becomes much easier to start reusing properties or reusing components by passing in essentially different dynamic sets of props and data. So this is where it starts to get very useful.
I have a question about props.
Yeah, go for it.
In passing the parameter, should you pass in props as an entire object, or should you destructure like whatever you want to use as a prop specifically?
Yeah, so when we like pass in like this, right, into a component, we'll want to have it split out based on the different properties individually. So, might have like a prop two equals, I don't know, five or something here, right? So this is how you would pass it in. And then the way that you absorb it then is this will come in as a single props object essentially into the component. And so in this case, you can see, right? For example, I have to access props.articles to get the articles prop. Now I could go in here and then access, props.prop2 or whatever, right? That I have set up, and then I can access this prop instead. That's how you would access it. One thing I would say that could make it cleaner a little bit is instead of going everywhere here and saying like props.articles and props.prop2, you can just destructure it in the constructor up here. So instead of props, I could just destructure it up here as articles and prop2 directly. And then here I can just directly access prop2 and articles. So
So
it
yeah,
becomes less repetitive.
yeah, that was gonna be my next question because like if you wanted to set a default value for one of those, um I mean, would you have to destructure like you wouldn't be able to can you do that if you just pass in props? Like if
Uh,
props.
so that's right. So if you don't destructure the props, then setting the defaults becomes more tricky. So this is where destructuring upfront does become helpful to set those defaults.
Okay, is there like a best practice?
I personally like destructuring the props because also it becomes very clear to me like what I should expect, right?
Right.
Otherwise it's just props and I'm just calling props dot articles and props dot whatever, should I show that whatever. Like it then becomes a bit of a free for all. So I personally like for organizational purposes like to destructure in the constructor so I know what's coming through.
Okay, thanks. And last question.
Mhm.
Is setting default props like is that common practice or does it not really happen often?
No, it's definitely common. I think it definitely depends on the use case, right? So I think it depends on whether Uh, yeah, I think it just depends, right, on the specific use case. But yeah, I think common props are default values for props are very common. For example, very simple example could be like so you have a component where you're showing a custom button of some kind, right, with some styles. A very common thing you might see is there'll be some default color for the button that's used, maybe like a gray or something. But you can pass as a prop, for example, like, oh, but if I don't want the default gray, I can instead pass in some custom color that button will become that color, right? So in that case, it's very useful to have a default because if the default's what's used a lot, then I almost never have to worry about passing it in. But in those certain use cases I want to override it, I still have the control to do that.
Okay, thanks.
Mhm. And you can see here, right? I had set maybe you saw this already, Sterling, but I kind of did an example of what the default props look like, right? Essentially, it's a simple, you can just, in the constructor, I just said prop2 equals 3. So 3 becomes the default value of this prop, for example. So in one case, in the first case, I actually explicitly set it to 5. And in the second case, I didn't pass it at all. So in this first list, you can see like this 5 is here, which is the explicit value I set. And then down here, this has the default 3. So it's pretty simple then to set default. You just essentially set it here in the constructor of the component.
Okay.
Other questions? Yeah, the one other thing I would also just call out is just as a thing to keep in mind. Because we are using JavaScript, this is why this is becoming a thing right now. But notice, for example, here, article list, I'm passing this prop2 value, right? But in the article list, I never handle it, right? It's like I never explicitly said, oh, there's a prop2 and I'm going to use it in some way. So and then obviously then it's not showing up in anywhere. So just be mindful of that. Let's say you setting something up and you know that something isn't working. Like this is always something to look at as like, oh, did I pass something that I forgot to use in some way, or did I forget to pass the attribute altogether and that's why it's not showing up? So just keep an eye out on that because React immediately will not tell you like hey, you're missing something here. All right, if there's no questions at this point on this, let's switch to talking about state. So remember, state is so props, right, were used to pass data essentially from a parent to a child component, which is like what we're doing here. State is about managing dynamic data that happens within the component. So I think a very simple way we could probably demonstrate this is instead of just rendering these two lists out using these two data sets, let's figure out a way we can swap the data sets that are being used to render out. So let me get rid of this. I can copy. And so if we think about it, right, what we want to happen in this app is we want to have some variable that holds an array of articles, and we want the ability to essentially swap the value of that variable. Maybe if we click a button or something, it will swap the two values, and then it should re-render everything out. So this calls for using React State to hold this dynamic variable for the articles. So let me create this here. So the way the syntax works, again, is to use the useState hook. So const, I'll write it out and then I'll explain this. Const articles set articles equals useState. Okay. So, and then we need to probably import this in a second. So useState is again how you create essentially some state variable that we're going to use. It returns technically an array with two values in that array. So that's why we've done this syntax. The first value of the array is the actual value that you can go use in other places. And the second value is this set, like what we call the setter for this variable, right? So whenever we want to change the value of this variable, let's say like here, right? Right now, it doesn't have a value. That's the other thing is useState by default. Whatever you pass into useState will be the default value of this variable. So right now it's just nothing. There's no value. You would at least probably want to put, in this case, an empty array, maybe as a default value. And you might say, like, let's do this in a second. So for articles now, let's instead of passing dummy articles directly, let's just pass this articles state variable instead. So we'll notice now there's nothing there. It's empty. And it's also probably erroring out if I'm looking at this correctly. Let's double check. Yes, okay. There's an error here, and that is because once this disappears, there we go. We need to import useState, and we got to import it from React. Typically, this would help us with that. I don't know why it's not. So by we import useState from React, so we have to import it because it's not by their default. Okay, so there's no error. Now we can see something. But now we're just having an empty array, so we don't expect it to render anything out. But let's say I wanted to set it to one of these values. So I could normally, right, in JavaScript, I would just say articles equals, let's say dummy articles, right? And I would expect, in this case, that the values here would just change. And in this case, it happens to for a different reason, of course. But normally, it turns out this won't work as we want. And actually, there's a different way I can show this, which we'll get to in a second. But actually, that was probably a bad example. It works because of some nuance in the dev environment right now. But let's say we want to switch the value of this maybe based on clicking a button, let's just say. So let me just add a button here and just say switch articles. And I'm just going to attach an onClick function. So I'm going to create a function here. I'll say handle button, which will just be called. And I will just say in this button, let's just set articles in this case to be dummy articles. And I'll just attach this to the onClick and the button. So every time this button is clicked, it will try to run this. So if I click this, I'm clicking it, it doesn't work. And that is because what is happening? What's happening is this is being called, and just to prove this is being called, I'll put a log statement here. Button is clicked. So let's try this. I'll open up the console so you can see it. Come on. Try this. Okay, that's always good to see. There we go. Let's focus down here where the console is. So I'm going to click the button. The button is being clicked, but the data is not being updated. And this comes down to, again, how React works to render, right? These components. So what's happening here is I'm saying, oh, articles should just equal dummy articles. Cool. But by default, this is just a regular JavaScript variable. So just setting it like this normally doesn't tell React that, hey, I actually need to go and re-render this entire component now because some important data has changed. It doesn't tell React to do that. And hence that's why like the UI isn't updated. So that's why we need a setter object. The setter object is it does this logic of updating the value of this articles variable, but in addition, it has that functionality of letting React know, hey, the value of this variable has changed. You need to re-render the UI. So instead, let's switch this and instead call set articles. So the way this will work is just call the set function and pass in the new value you want. So let's say pass in dummy articles, for example. Now let's try this. If I click the button, the data is there. So let me pause there. Questions on any of that? Because again, this is like a really important part of React, really foundational part. So I want to make sure you all are feeling reasonably good about it.
So you're not able to call set articles outright. You have to put that within a different function.
You can call it outright. Typically, right, the way this would work is typically you would want to call this in the context of some action happening, right? In most cases, like, oh, a button got clicked, call it, right? Or there'll be other things that we'll see in the future in the class, like other examples. But typically, it's like something has happened, and then we want to change the state in some way. So that's what's happening just in this example, right? We're just encapsulating it here. Theoretically, if I didn't want to create the separate function, I could have just directly called it in the onClick here. So I could have just said, let me just define a function here and call set articles, dummy articles. And this would have worked. I refresh, still works. But yeah, I can now call this anywhere. It's just a function at the end of the day.
Okay, but set articles always has to be, I guess, associated with another function. In this
It
case, function.
in this like there's no rule that says you can't, right? Because at the end of the day, it's like set functions is just set articles is just a function, right? It's a good old JavaScript function. It's just in most cases, right? You're going to call it in the context of some action happening, right? And most of those cases, you typically will have when some action happens, you're like call this function, right? And that's where you would call it. But technically speaking, there's no like JavaScript won't prevent you from calling this in any way because it's just a function at the end of the day.
So like I guess what's the difference between onClick equals arrow function versus onClick equals just set articles?
So uh the reason you cannot do this is because set articles you need to pass it something, right? So you need to pass in what the new value you want. So
Oh,
I like, you might say just call like do this, right?
yeah.
This is not valid since this is not valid JavaScript anymore. So onClick needs to be if you like, let me just hover over it. Okay, that's not a very helpful definition. But essentially onClick needs to be at minimum, it would need to be a function that doesn't take any values in, right?
Okay.
So that's why, for example, that's why originally when I did this, I had this handle button function, which doesn't take any values in, right? It just executes some code. So I could just do handle button. This is valid JavaScript because now if I run it, like this all works. So that's just JavaScript syntax at that point because set articles, you have to pass it something. And therefore you either need to, in this case, encapsulate in some function, which doesn't take any arguments, or you need to do what I did. You can just inline do an arrow function here, right? And do kind of what's called like an anonymous function, right? And call it.
Okay. I got what you're saying. Because it takes, I guess, an argument, it has to be past that.
Yeah,
So, okay, I got you.
exactly. Because by default, on click, if you just pass it a function, it has to be a function that doesn't take any arguments, which is what we're doing here. We're essentially constructing a function that doesn't take any arguments, and then inside of it, we're just calling this articles, right? In either of these cases.
Okay.
Okay. Is state essentially just a switch from dynamically updating data? If possible, is there any way to show a different use case when this example? Are they typically always in app.jsx or can be passed from another file? Okay. So, okay, there's a lot of good questions in that. So is state essentially just a switch for dynamically updating data? Yes. Like that's how I would conceptually think about state is essentially there's a piece of dynamic data within this component that's going to be changing in some way. And use state, like state is the way to manage that data essentially. And by the way, you can create as many state variables as you want in the function in a component. Like I've written components that probably have 10 state variables in them, right? There's no limit to that. If possible, is there any way to show a different use case with this example? Yeah, we can do another example. And then are they typically always in app.jsx? No. So this state, you can put state anywhere. You can put state in any component you want. In this case, obviously, it's not very complex. So at this point, it would make sense to put the state up here, right? Um, but that is a good call. I will call attention to the structure that we're starting to see here a little bit. And that is in the parent component, we have some state, and we are passing the current value of the state as a prop into a child component in this case to then render out. So that overall structure is very common that you will see. And the reason is because there might be another component here we might make that also relies on this state value. So in that case, you have to put the state at the common parent of all the components that need to consume that state. So that then that parent can pass in that state value as props into all the children that need it. So that is one thing I'll call out. We're starting to see that structure here, and that's a pretty common structure that you will see in React applications. But technically speaking, no. I mean, you can put it in the app component, the states, if you need it. If that's the right place to put it, great. But it can go anywhere you need it to. Yep. Yeah. Let's do another example. I think that's a good call. So here's what I'm going to do. Let's add some state potentially in the article list component. This is a bit of a Tor example, but I think this will suffice to show you kind of what we can do with state. So let's say that for each of these articles that we're rendering out, let's say if we click a button, we want to change something about them, right? Maybe want to hide something from this, just as an example. So let's use state for that. So I mean, let's just this is a bit of a contrived example, but let's say for each of these kind of blocks for the article, if we click the title, we want to hide this description here at the bottom. And if we click it again, we want to show the description again. So the way I would think about it, right, is again, there's some dynamic behavior happening in this component, contained to this component. I want to use React state. And in this case, what's the dynamic variable I need to track is essentially a variable that stores, should I show this article.body or should I hide it? conceptually. So I'm going to create some React state for that. And one thing that you might notice is we're saying we want this at the level of each of these individual blocks. So to really make this work, we actually want to make each of these blocks a separate component. So let's just quickly do that. And we can just do it actually in the same file just for simplicity. So I'm going to create a new component down here. I'll call it article card. Doesn't look like a card right now, but maybe eventually we'll make it look like that. And this will take some state. Let's say we'll pass in a single article data, piece of article data. So we'll pass that in a second. And let's just essentially copy the JSX here that we've written to render out. And let's just move it into this card. And of course, C is why is it returning an error? Okay, we'll see what's going on here. Why it's not liking that. All right, some live debugging together. Let's see, why doesn't it like all of this? Wonder if it will just like it if I pass this in. And we'll talk about this. Okay, why doesn't it like it? Invalid parenthesize assignment pattern. Okay, try this. Oh. All right, live debugging. It is an error. Yes, you're correct. I forgot. I forgot the error. There we go. Thank you. Thank you, Elena. All right. Okay. So what I did here is all I did is kind of just like we did before. I create a new component in this case for rendering out just an individual article. I said we'll take as a prop some article data that we'll pass into it, and then we'll render out the same thing we had before and all the attributes of this article, right? And now I've gone up to the article list, and you can see kind of the nesting of components we're getting now, and we're saying, okay, for every article in articles, we're going to map over it, and we're just going to render out an article card, and we're going to pass down that article prop with the article data from the array. So again, functionally, nothing is different. We're just further compartmentalizing things into components, which is always generally a good thing because now you can see here is actually like quite easy to read. You can say, okay, I have an article list. I am mapping over the articles data and I'm just rendering out a card. Easy, very simple to read. So now we want to control things at each individual article card. So that's why I went through this trouble. So let's store state for each article card individually. I'm going to create some state. I'm going to say is body hidden, set is body hidden, and notice how I'm naming as well these things. So the way typically the best practice for naming the state related variables and functions is you have the variable, right? In this case, I'm calling it is body hidden. And then typically for the setter, you can name it whatever you want. The best practice is to call it set and then whatever the name of your variable is. So in this case, I said set is body hidden. Use state, and initially I'm going to set to false. I don't want this to be hidden by default. And we need to import. First, the import's not working, so we're going to import use state from React. And it's telling us and complaining to us that it's not used yet, which is fine. And very simply, what I can just do here is render out this paragraph based on whether this is true or not. I don't know if we've covered this yet explicitly in the course, or if we're going to see that later, but we can do what's called conditional rendering here. So I can say, if is body hidden is not true, so I'll put an exclamation point, then I will render out this p tag, otherwise it won't render out. So that should still show things by default here, but let's say we're going to have this be true to start with. it will hide out everything. Questions on any of that? Because we did quite a bit of moving around before we make use of this state in earnest. All right, so let's make use of this state for something. But you can already start to see, right? I can manually just go in, and if I just toggle the values, right, I'm already getting the behavior I want. So now I just have to tie this changing the value to some action of some kind. So in this case, let's say if we click the title, then it's switch to value, right? So I'm going to go into this H1, and I'm going to say on click. So if I tap this H1, in this case, I'll just use an arrow function here. I'll just say set is body hidden. And in this case, I want to just toggle it back and forth between false and true based on the current value. Now, one way you can do this is you can just say not is body hidden. So just the reverse of whatever the current value is. And if I try this and click this title, there you go. We're toggling whether this is shown or not just for this individual component. Because remember, this state is scoped to each component. So this component, I can toggle it. This one, I can toggle it. So we can keep toggling here. I will call out, there's another way you can use set is body hidden. So one way is you can just directly pass the new value you want. The other thing you can do actually is it can take a function where you get the previous value of the state variable, and then you can do something that's previous value. So in this case, I just want to invert the previous value directly. Again, in this case, I would just to keep things simple, just have what we had before, just say not is body hidden. But there will be cases that you will see where you actually just want to take the current value and then do something with it. So this is the syntax for how you would pass that in. I will also just make a very explicit call out, by the way. You should pretty much never do what I've just done, which is set an on-click on an H1 tag, because it's really bad for accessibility, because headings are not supposed to be able to click. The way I would do this actually is I would probably surround this in the button. Let's just do it now, just because I said it. Surround this in the button, which is expected to be clicked, a component that should be clicked. I'll put the on-click on the button, and then I'll just put the H1 inside the button. It will look a little bit different by default because of the button styling. You can change that obviously and override it. But this is like properly from accessibility perspective, like this is how you would do what I've just done technically. And if I click it, obviously it has the same behavior. But for demonstration purposes, I just set the on-click directly on the H1. Let me just switch it back. Okay, questions on any of that we just did? Hopefully another example of state to see kind of a different way it can be used.
Can you explain the JSX where the where it says not is body hidden, and
Yep.
it's like a little different than the I guess the other way, the ternary operator way.
Yep. So yeah. So I think just to be explicit, right? The other way I think what you're talking about is you might say, um, you could say if is body hidden is true, then you might render like a p tag that's like hidden or something. Else you render the actual content, right? So to be clear, if I click on this, it'll just switch essentially what gets rendered. Um, in some cases, you might not want, right, to show this. And so the other way is sort of syntax I use, which again, you'll see this pretty frequently, is essentially if I just want to render something based on the value of something, I would use this syntax. So the way this actually works under the hood is at first, and this is kind of at the JavaScript level, right? Is it looks at this expression and says, I'm going to evaluate this expression left to right. So I'm going to go to the left and I'm going to first evaluate this. So is body hidden? Okay, that's false in this case, right? Or in this case, that's true, right? Because the current value is false, so not, it'll be this will return true. And it recognizes as an ampersand, right? So then it says, okay, I can keep going and actually reading the rest of this because the value of this was true. And so then it actually, that's why it actually gets to this part and can render it out. Now, let's say this was true instead. This would go and calculate the false. And when it gets to the ampersand, it says, well, already I've calculated something that's false. And I know I'm just going to ampersand, essentially it's an and operator, right, to whatever comes afterwards. So I already know this is going to end up being false, the whole thing, because something's already false. So I'm just going to skip the rest of this. So it just ignores it. It doesn't even evaluate the rest of it. So it's just a
Oh,
shorthand way to do that.
gotcha. Thanks.
Yeah, so typically what I would say is if you want to render something out either way, use the ternary operator like you mentioned, like we have below. But if you only care about rendering out if something is true, essentially, this is a good shorthand way to do that. Other questions from folks? If you still have questions about props, we can talk about that. Like, be about anything we talked about today.
Just to rephrase what you've taught to maybe give myself some bit of clarity is state is always defined inside the component, which is what you've done with article card. And when that state is when that property is passed on to a different component, and that's a prop.
Yes, that's right. That's exactly right. And yeah, this was the other example, exactly what you just said, right? Is an app. This needs to be a const. That's another important thing is you should, whenever you have use state, you should have it be a constant, not a let. So that was the case here. So that's best practice. But yes, in app, we have the article data is a state variable. But yes, when we pass it down, we have to pass it down as props. So yeah, exactly what you said. I'm just gonna add a note here since you all can look at this code later. Never do what I did here and have an on click on an H1 for accessibility, wrap instead in something like a button. Okay, just so that's abundantly clear. Any other questions about state props? Do you also have questions? Oh, well, I'm just realizing as I'm looking at this, we never actually completed this first example. Uh, I guess we kind of did. We said let's just go from empty to something, but let's have it. Let's finish this and let's have it switch between the two article sources. So, move this console. So typically here, I would say by default we probably want the value to be one of these. So let's just set the default value to dummy articles, and then when we click the button, we essentially want to switch between the two sources. So I would say something like if articles equals to dummy articles, then we set articles to the other object. Else, we'll set articles to dummy articles, because then that means that it's probably dummy articles 2 right now. So let's just try this. Oh, this is because this was hidden by default. So let's make it not hidden by default. So if I switches to the second array, which just had the one article. If I switch it, goes back to the other one. So I can just switch back and forth as many times as I want now. So hopefully you're starting to see we can start to do more interesting stuff now once we start introducing the concept of state. All right. Any other questions about state, props? Also, if you have any questions in the last couple of minutes about issues you run into on your assignments or GitHub issues or whatever, that we're happy to talk about.
Yeah, I was kind of a bit confused with regards to the data that we're supposed to use in CTD Swag. I wasn't sure if we're supposed to use it in that repo or we're supposed to use it in our to-do list. A bit confusing to me.
Yeah. So, and Anthony, I don't know if you saw the message, my reply I sent to your message on this in the Slack. But essentially, the CTT Swag app is meant to just be a reference example app. So just like here, we're like kind of creating this blog. Um,
Yeah.
the CTD Swag is just supposed to be another kind of example, just to see these concepts in action, right? So
Okay.
that's completely separate from sort of the to-do list app that you're building. It's just supposed to be an
Right.
example, essentially, to reference these concepts. So all the
Okay.
things that you need for your assignment will be there's like if you scroll down towards the bottom of every week, there'll be a section
Yeah.
which is coding assignment. So everything below that is actually the assignment that you need to submit.
Yeah. Okay. So, because what I was thinking was that data was supposed to help us practice with the CTD squad so that we can easily
Yeah,
do the assignment. That was what I was thinking. But when I went into CTD squad, the what I was supposed to do was already in there. So I was like, I'm a bit confused. Like, what am I supposed to do with this data?
yeah,
If what I'm saying makes sense.
yeah. And let's did you check by chance? Are there branches in that re repository besides just the main branch? I wonder if they've split it by week.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have contributed into that branch, so I'm not sure if it's like it looks to me like an already completed project and not like
Got it.
a
Okay.
project that we are supposed to work into, if you get what I mean.
Yeah, got it. Yep. Okay. Um, yeah, I would essentially treat it, yeah, essentially as an example that you can reference. I think in
Okay.
the materials for every week, I think they will do a good job of like copying and pasting the relevant code essentially that you actually should care about anyway. So you shouldn't need to look at the repository really. It's more
Yeah. All
just
right.
there if
Cool.
you want. Um, but yeah, you can treat that as essentially completely separate from your assignments.
Okay. Cool. Great.
Any other questions from anyone about at this point about anything class related?
When will this be, I guess the recording be added to the repo?
It should be pretty quick after this session. I think it should be probably the next 30-ish minutes. I'll probably be able to get it up. It just is up to Zoom compiling the recording and then YouTube's upload processing. But within like within an hour for sure, it should be up and in the repository.
Okay, thanks.
Mhm.
And sorry, I might have missed it when you were talking to Anthony. Would you recommend doing the CTE swag store like to code along, or like will we have all the resources to even do that, or is it just strictly like bits and pieces to reference?
I would say, so I would say, admittedly, first off, this is the first time in this class that we even have this CTD swag. Previously, that did nothing like that existed. Um, I would say I think helpful. At minimum, you should read through it. I think it's helpful just to get a sense for sort of how these concepts actually come to life as a reference example. I think I'll leave it up to you whether you actually want to code along essentially every week on that project because it's extra work. It could be helpful if you're struggling with the concepts. Like it's a good just to see that example in action. But at minimum, I would say just read through it, get a sense for what's going on, make sure you understand it, and then the good way to test essentially understanding is say, okay, how can I apply this right in the to-do app?
Okay.